As Will said, it's going to be on the early history of the railway, and we've titled this "The Day the Railway Changed Everything." So I want to start first by imagining a journey from Newcastle to London, or London to Newcastle. It's a journey that some of you might have done, and these days, of course, it's a fairly easy journey. You can do it by car, you can do it by train, you can do it even by flight, and it's a few hours. It's not a big journey. And according to Google, if you walk it, it's 91 hours or 92 hours. I'd be very impressed if anybody could walk for that long. But it gives you a sense of how big of a journey this is. So now I want us to imagine if we undertook this journey at different points through time. So if we start at 43 AD, the beginning of the Roman conquest of Britain, the fastest way to travel at this point would have been on horseback, by horse. And this journey would take you around about 6 days on horseback. If we were to look at it during a different period, about 1,000 years later, 1066 AD, the Norman conquest of Britain, it would be the same journey. Still, the fastest method to travel overland was horseback. And again, it would take you about 6 days. So if we flash forward another 500 years, roughly, to the end of the Elizabethan era. Once again, the fastest method of traveling overland is still horseback, and the journey is going to take you about 6 days. But if we move forward to 1844, when the first passenger train makes this journey from London to Newcastle, the journey time is now 9 hours. This is obviously an incredible leap forward in travel time. And it's also important because we don't think of any of those periods of time, the Roman era of Britain, the Norman era of Britain, or the Elizabethan era of Britain, as anywhere similar or connected. But they do share one common theme, and that is that the technology we use to travel had not progressed even slightly. Horses may have been bred to be a little bit faster. Roads may have been improved a little bit, that kind of thing. But the travel time remains about the same. And it isn't until 1844, really, that all of a sudden a huge leap forward is made in the technology that we use to travel. And so the talk tonight, as I said, is called "The Day the Railway Changed Everything." And if we want to look to a specific day that changed everything, that day would be September 27th, 1825. And this was the day that the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened. Now, the prime purpose of the Stockton and Darlington Railway was to transport coal from the collieries in southwest Durham to the River Tees at Stockton, which from there it could be exported by ship to anywhere it needed to go. And it wasn't the first ever railway. There were other places in the country that tracks were laid and some sort of machine, transported things along it. But this was the first public railway that used a steam locomotive. And it's the public element that's really important there. Because if we're thinking of this as an event that changed the world, it has to be something that applies to the broader public, that more and more people can access. And this is it. Now, the railway's first journey was a very interesting one. It was fraught with problems, mismanagement. For a start, around about 200 more people than were allowed to be on the journey arrived, and so there were people who were sitting in or riding along in the coal wagons of the train. There was a lot more people than were meant to be there, and this led to problems such as one man fell off the train and injured himself. I believe actually the train ran over his leg, a pretty horrific injury, and it was filled with disasters. Like, for example, the train broke down about 5 or 6 times along the way. I had to stop for repairs. The whole journey took over 3 hours, which is a distance that you could very easily walk from Stockton to Darlington in 3 hours. But despite this, it was deemed as a huge success. It was massively well received by the public. They loved it. There was even a banquet dinner held afterwards. It's clear that people saw through the teething problems of this and were really just aware that this was a huge moment, something, you know, bigger than themselves. And so here's just a map of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. As you can see, that the black line there is how it was 1 year after it opened in 1826. And just the red line is the current railway lines in the area. But for me, this map and the story of Stockton and Darlington Railway is really important because I grew up in Billingham, which is just next to Stockton there on the map. And this area of the country is usually overlooked by the history books. Very little is often said about it. But here it's the beginning of a global railway revolution. And, you know, it's something that, for me, being from this area, you know, it's something that I can really be quite proud of. Oh, sorry, I've jumped forward a little bit there. And so the locomotive that was used on the Stockton and Darlington Railway's maiden voyage was locomotion number 1, which you can see on the bottom picture there on the right. That is locomotion number 1, and that is when it was housed in Head of Steam Museum in Darlington, which it was until, I believe, literally either last week or this week, very recently, it was quite controversially moved. I think the National Railway Museum has moved it to one of their sites at Shildon. A little bit of controversy about that. But anyway, so that is locomotion number 1. And as you can see above it, that is a 3-year-old me stood in front of a replica of locomotion number 1, which I think is a Beamish. So clearly an interest from a young age there. Locomotion number 1 was the first steam-powered railway engine to run on a public railway. It was originally named Active, and it was designed by George Stephenson, father of Robert Stephenson. You'll know the Stephensons, of course, from Stephenson's Rocket. The Stockton and Darlington Railway Company paid £550 each for locomotion number 1 and for its sister engine, Hope. So, I mean, £550 in today's money is roughly £44,000. So quite a big investment. Little interesting fact or potential fact about locomotion number 1 sister engine, Hope. There is some evidence to suggest it might have ran on the Wensleydale line, but we're not 100% sure. Don't hold me to it. And locomotion number 1 was retired in 1857, so quite a long service. It got about 30 years of service from it. Now, here is a phrase that is sometimes used to describe the impact that the railways had, and that is as an annihilation of time and space. It's an incredible phrase. It really just does describe the destructive nature of the railways, not literally, but on the way that the world was. It shows the revolutionary and all-encompassing impact of the railways. And in this sense, the railways can be considered in the same vein as other 19th century inventions, such as the telephone, photography. These are all things that changed the way we perceived the world. So in the same way that if you tried to describe to somebody before the telephone was invented that you can speak, you can hear and speak to somebody that is hundreds of miles away, it would be pretty mind-blowing. And similarly, if you were to say that there will be a network of tracks that spread all around the country, and you can, you know, without using any of your own energy, you can travel at high speeds, you know, to almost wherever you want, that too would be pretty mind-blowing. And at the heart of this idea of annihilation of time and space, the railways destroyed traditional relationships with nature. So imagine a before and after scenario where the world before the railways exists and railways come along, and then the railways change this forever. There isn't really a going back. And we'll have a little bit of a further look into this when we examine time. So time is obviously a huge part of running a railway. Sort of an iconic element of any railway station is a clock. Even today, in modern railway stations, they have the electronic clocks that say, you know, the time, departure times, that kind of thing. Time management is just really important in running a railway. And as you can see on the bottom image there, that is a photo of Leeming Bar Station from the 1950s. And if you can just see in that little red square, that is where the station's clock was, and I believe it has just been reinstalled today. So when Lehman Bar Station opens, you can go down and have a look at the lovely the clock in there. But scheduling demanded a collective agreement on time. So in order to make railway schedules, everybody's got to be on the same page. And that was not possible when railways first opened. There was not a standardization of time in this country. So I'll put a few examples there. In Oxford, time was 5 minutes behind Greenwich Mean Time. In Leeds, it was 6 minutes behind Greenwich Mean Time. And in London, it was 6 minutes ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. So imagine trying to create a railway schedule with everywhere having slight variations in time. It would be impossible. Until 1848, when the British Clearing House adopts Greenwich Mean Time as railway time. So this was a standard time across all railways. All railways in the country ran on this time. And this was actually followed almost 30 years later, over 30 years later, sorry, when England adopts Greenwich Mean Time. So we actually see the railways pioneering this idea of a uniform time that was then followed by the rest of the country. And shorter travel times also changed society's relationship with time. Going back to the journey that we visualized at the start, if you can imagine, if a journey goes from taking 6 days, almost a week of your life, to a few hours, it changes the way that we perceive time. So think of it in today's terms. We have, mass connectivity through the internet and such. We expect everything to happen really quickly. And this is a little bit like that. All of a sudden, because things can be moved or people can be moved quicker, things are expected to happen more quickly. And the other component is space. And so this can be perceived in a few different ways. One is that shorter commute times make the world much smaller. So what we mean by that is, if you're able to get to somewhere more quickly, again, going back to the 6 days to a few hours example from our journey, all of a sudden the world seems like a smaller place, but also it becomes much bigger because you can suddenly access a greater range. People now have increased time and the ability to travel further and further afield. And so it expands the accessible world. And there are also changes to the physical space or the physical landscape and the observable world. So things like viaduct, which is pictured there, and tunnels dug through the hills, through mountains, things like that. Literal changes to the world around us. And viaducts are quite an interesting example because the last civilization which built viaducts en masse was, of course, the Romans. And it invokes a similar idea of imperialism, this idea that this change to the physical world is like a conquering of the world around us, shaping it to the way that we want it. And another interesting example of changes to space is maps. Maps are a way that we perceive the world around us without actually having to look at it. And the railways changed maps massively. In a world before motorways, the maps became dominated by the sprawling network of railway lines. An example is such as in the one there in the bottom. So we have a little look at infrastructure and innovation, because of course it's one thing to build the actual tracks that the engines run on, but there's a huge amount of infrastructure that's got to go with it. And so we've talked about some of the larger ones, things like tunnels and viaducts, but in smaller built up areas or larger built up areas, cities, towns, villages, wherever it is, we see new infrastructure built, such as stations, signal boxes, goods sheds, switch yards. And these are all things that, these are mostly things that would have been completely alien to people. Nobody knew what a switch yard was before the rails because there wasn't really such a thing as a switch yard, same with signal boxes. So it changes the towns as well as the landscape. And as well as this, obviously these new infrastructures need to be built, but not only built, but maintained and ran. So we see huge amounts of new employment roles crop up, from more hands-on ones, things like engineers, builders, and navies. Navies in particular are really interesting. Navies or navigational engineers largely were workers who came over from Ireland, and they built much of the infrastructure of Britain's early railways. And so we see here the railways also influencing demographic shifts, mass immigration that comes over just to help build and facilitate these railways. And there was also less hands-on roles, things like station master. Station master, obviously, he's in charge of the station and that building, but he's also a figure in the community. And so we see the community start to shape around these stations and around the station masters, changes there again. And we also see an expansion of the original purpose of railways. So going back to the Stockton-Darlington Railway, as I mentioned, it was originally to transport coal from collieries. And we see this expanded as more and more businesses start using railway to transport their goods or their materials. So an example that's relevant to us is Harkness and Sons. They were horticulturalists based in Leeming Bar. And because they had Leeming Bar Station right on their doorstep, they were able to travel all around the country, compete in competitions, transport the roses for sale, etc. So this facilitated that. And it's worth remembering that while the railways were happening, the Industrial Revolution was already in full swing. The railways were part of a wider Industrial Revolution, and this began in the 18th and 19th centuries, mostly in the factories. And a big part of the Industrial Revolution, as with the railways, was coal. And coal creates a pretty interesting positive feedback loop with the railways, because coal needs the railways because they transport the coal all around the country to wherever it needs to go. But the railways also need coal because that is literally what trains run on. So you see the loop occurring there. And for many, the railways served as the first time they were presented with the Industrial Revolution. So as I mentioned, it began in factories in the 18th century. And unless you worked in those factories or lived nearby or were directly involved in them, you weren't really seeing the Industrial Revolution take shape. You weren't really seeing much of this progress until the trains come along, because they are pretty unignorable. All of a sudden, the landscape has changed. You've got these huge mechanical beasts almost tearing through the countryside, billowing steam. And with this, the changes in the cities, like we said, with stations and all the infrastructure. So for many, this was a slap in the face with the Industrial Revolution. And so we've talked about the actual building of it, but it doesn't quite fully put into perspective what a huge undertaking the building of the railways was. It could be likened to building an empire, because it required vast amounts of manpower. Obviously, we talked a little bit about some of the roles, but it required huge amounts, and it required a lot of other things, such as political will. It needed the approval of the powers that be to go ahead. It needed money. It needed investment. And it needed the trust of everybody involved that this was something that was going to work, and this was something that was going to be worthwhile, because it was a massive undertaking. And also, it completely altered time and space, as we talked about. And this was changed forever. It's hard to understate the railways when standard time for the entire country is literally being based around the railways, when huge aspects of the landscape are being changed irreparably just to facilitate the railways. There were massive efforts that were made to make the railway appear grand and extravagant. So if you look at just a couple of examples of the stations pictured there, stations don't have to look like that. They can function without looking like these grandiose and regal almost buildings, but they were made to look like that. And it gives you the sense that the railways weren't just there as a function. They were part of something bigger. They were part of a much bigger project. And of course, the railways also changed culture and society. There's a really nice quote there from Emile Zola, who said, "Our artists have to find poetry in train stations the way their fathers found poetry in forests and rivers." So it's this kind of idea of adapting to the new world that railways ushered in. And if you look on the left there, the first painting, it's pretty much got all your hallmarks of a standard natural painting. It's got the lush green trees, it's got the lovely fields, the rolling hills, it's got the river. but you might be able to see cutting straight through the middle of the painting is a viaduct, a railway viaduct. So it shows the way that the railways kind of bled into the culture in the world of art. And the middle one shows a steam engine a bit more imposingly. As you can see, it's traveling over a group of traveling monks over a viaduct. And there's quite an interesting message here. It's almost positioning the railways above, these monks above religion, almost as if railway is like a new religion. And the final one on the right there, you can see of the two ladies in a first-class train carriage. Train carriages were actually designed with the traditional horse and carriages in mind. This idea that you've got two seats sitting opposite each other so that, you know, you are staring at the person you're traveling with. And this led to a bit of a shift in the culture of travel, because those fortunate enough to be able to travel by horse and carriage, they would usually know the person they were traveling with. There might be occasions where they didn't, but if they did, you know, they were kind of forced to engage in conversation because it was just them in a small carriage, possibly for a long journey. Railways completely changed that, because now all of a sudden you've got carriages completely filled with masses of people you probably don't know. And this is where we see trends like reading while traveling emerge, you know, because you might not want to have to speak to the person that you sat opposite. So we've talked about all the great things that the railway brought in, all these amazing changes, but ultimately there were some resistance and some fears around the ushering in of the railway age. So it was an emergence of a strange and dangerous new technology in an emerging industrial world. So it's easier for us now with hindsight to look back as the railways as part of one big, you know, industrial revolution, but this happened gradually. And for many people, they weren't prepared for what is, you know, a life-changing new technology. And one way that we can perceive this is through railway regulations, which are essentially a history of misfortune. Every law, every rule, or almost every law and every rule that's in place on railway safety and conduct is there because an accident has occurred that has forced people to implement it. And you can see there, that image is actually from 1895 and in Paris. Unsurprisingly, it's not easy to find 19th century images of train crashes. But this is a particularly extreme one. As you can see, the train has literally went through the buffers and out the other end of the station. But these are the kind of images that could be conjured up in people's heads when they see this, you know, sort of emerging new railway. You know, the worst case scenario, the idea of them just being massive, destructive, you know, disasters that, you know, will kill anybody who goes on them. And this also wasn't helped by some of the rumors and hearsay that went around at the time, some of the fears that people had about humans traveling on the railways. Some ridiculous examples include this idea that women's bodies weren't designed to travel on a high-speed train and that their uteruses would fly out because of the speed. Other ones, such as, you know, humans weren't supposed to travel at such high speeds, and their skeletons would be ripped out of their skin and they would just be left as like a standing sort of mess of bone and, you know, ridiculous things like that, that at the time to us, you know, who were informed, seem absolutely ridiculous. But to somebody who's never been on a train and sees it as a completely new technology, it's a bit more understandable why these kind of things spread around. But there was also just the disruption element of the railways. So for many people, particularly in rural communities, this brought about a massive change, and the railways present a threat possibly to their way of life. So we think about the ways that the tracks cut through the countryside. That might be right next to you, you know, if you're a farmer, it might be right next to your field. You might see it spooking the horses. And another element, if we're looking at the threat to the way of living, people talk about cars as, you know, the end of horses' occupations in a way. But the railways were just as much. They kind of removed some of the necessity for horse travel. So just a few final thoughts to kind of wrap up everything that we've talked about. So we started by looking at a journey, a hypothetical journey, and obviously railway completely revolutionized this, but it revolutionized so much more than just traveling. And if we were to imagine a before, we've talked about a before and after world on the railways. If we imagined a world where time and space had not been annihilated as it was, it's inconceivable for us because the railways are so ingrained into us, such a big part of our world that it's almost impossible to imagine a world where it hadn't standardized time, where it hadn't changed the landscape, where it hadn't sped up travel so massively. And it's also important just to emphasize that it was a national cooperation. The railways required uniformity, as we've seen through adopting standardized time, standardizing of maps, things like this. And they also required mass engagement to succeed. If people hadn't traveled on the railways, it would have all been for nothing. It would have failed. So if we look back to the idea of building an empire, it really is this all-encompassing sort of effort on almost the entire country's part that led us to the rails that we have today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Connor, for that. So there's lots of things that's been pulled on there, and I think it's really, really interesting to, it's almost imperceivable to think of